All right. Well, looks like we're at the top of the hour again. So I'm kicking things off again with a presentation. So we've just got our last couple presentations here. We're kind of in the home stretch uh, for the last hour. I can admit Ellen in. And so I'm going to be talking about running perfSONAR in Docker. So I guess just jump right into it. So basically what to expect from what I'm going to talk about today. This is a pretty broad topic. This is mostly, I guess you could think of as an introduction to how to run perfSONAR Docker. We've had some Docker images available for quite a while. I just kind of want to show people some of the ways you can use those and talk about some of the interesting things you can do with that. Kind of the impression I get is not everybody has necessarily played around with those. So I just kind of want to show the basic capabilities. I'm not going to get into some of the more advanced, interesting topics about how to like orchestrate a whole bunch of perfSONAR containers with like Kubernetes or something like that. I know there's actually different groups of people doing some interesting work in those areas, but that's really kind of not the focus of the talk today. I kind of think of this as more of the kind of gateway drug to those other talks, right? I'm just going to kind of talk about the intro so you can get playing around with Docker, and then hopefully, when you're doing that, you'll see some of maybe the broader implications or be interested in learning more about some of the other interesting stuff that people might do with it. So that's kind of what to expect. So I assume probably most people have heard of Docker or are familiar with it. But in case you're not, so Docker is basically an open platform for running applications and containers. One of the big advantages of it is it's supported across a number of operating systems. So, Linux obviously is where it runs best, but you can actually run it on Mac and even Windows. And yeah, I can't believe a few years ago, I probably wouldn't believe you if I was saying this, but you can actually run a perfSONAR instance with Docker on a Windows box. I've done it. So that's kind of cool. Now there's obviously some caveats and things there that I'll talk about. But the fact that you can do that pretty easily is kind of cool. And so in a lot of ways, Dockers, there's a bunch of different, types of, or a bunch of different container technologies out there. One nice thing about Docker, though, kind of how Git is with GitHub, Docker has what it calls Docker Hub, where you can basically upload and register images, and then it's really easy on your system to just do a Docker pull perfSONAR/test point, for example, right? And it just pulls it down. And there's a whole bunch of other tools. I'll talk about a couple of them today. That you can use to run the Docker containers. So it's not even just the technology; it's kind of like the environment that comes with it, and the suite of tools and things that you get access to, which I think contributes to its popularity. So why would you want to run perfSONAR on Docker? So I generally think of this as again focusing kind of on the simple cases. It's about usually isolation and/or portability. So one nice thing about Docker, right, is the container it basically carves out as a piece of the system for you. You can all the libraries and everything like that are isolated from the rest of the system. So there's times maybe where you have to worry about conflicts or something like that with something needing a different version of HTTPD or something like that. We've run into stuff like that before with tools like GridFTP. And if it's just in Docker, it's kind of all separate and on its own, right? And you don't have to worry about it. And then the other piece I kind of alluded to earlier is portability. Is it actually runs on a number of OSs, and for that reason, in particular, I kind of find it as one of my favorite ways to kind of bring up an ad hoc tester. So if you've been around for perfSONAR for quite a while, many years ago, we actually had something called the live CD, which was essentially a version of Linux that basically just booted completely from the CD-ROM. You didn't install it at all. And so the idea behind that was to be an ad hoc tester. Now, the way people used it, there was all this weird stuff you could also do to turn it into a permanent tester that was really ugly in the live CD case. So eventually we dropped support for that because it was kind of just a mess to maintain and things like that. But in some ways, I kind of view this as a cleaner version of that, or at least cleaner in my mind. So yeah, it's really great for just kind of bringing up a container, running your test, and you can delete it like it was never there, right? And it's pretty lightweight. Some other reasons you might do it So I know a lot of organizations have been looking closer and closer at Docker. If you happen to work for a Docker shop, right, and they don't want the traditional RPMs or Debian packages or things like that, that might be a reason to kind of look at this. Another one is some advanced use cases, like if what I really like about the Docker containers too is if you're like doing some development, it's really easy to kind of pull a bunch of different containers together. For example, if you're testing with some Elastic stuff, if you want to bring up our test point container and an Elasticsearch container or something like that and play with it, you can just do that. If you've got some advanced experiment or orchestrating resources dynamically, that's great. And my lunch breakout, Brian Tierney mentioned one that he's been playing around with, which is right now, the OSs we support don't actually have patches for BBR2. So he needs to use Ubuntu 20, which we don't support yet. That is coming, but what he can do right now is just run Ubuntu 20, run the Docker container on that. The container actually inherits the TCP settings from the bare metal host, and so it basically can run the BBR2 tests that way. So there's all sorts of kind of interesting things you can do like that with a Docker container. So what do we actually make available right now in Docker? So we've had these available for a number of years now. Again, this is more stuff that's not necessarily new in 4.3, but you maybe haven't looked at before. So one is just, it's called perfSONAR tools. It's really basic. It's just a bunch of command line clients essentially. And it's got it like, it's got iPerf3 and things like that. It also has the pschedule CLI, but when we say like CLI, like you can't actually run tests from the thing running the container. You can just essentially run third-party tests if you run that. The one I use most often is actually the other one, which is perfSONAR test point. So that has everything in tools, but then you get a full pscheduler server, so you can actually schedule tests, from the node that you're on. If you want to do like regular tests or anything like that, I'll talk about some of the considerations around that and get going. There's a PS config agent and the lookup service registration agent and all of that, right? So that's what we have available now. We've talked about doing some of the other bundles. I'd expect going forward, we'll add some more. We haven't done a toolkit or anything like that to date. One thing we're constantly looking at is the way we kind of do things is a little bit anti-Docker in the sense that we bundle kind of everything together as one image, and we could probably split out applications a little bit more. But anyways, this is what we have today, and they kind of really are targeted towards that ad hoc use case I was talking about. So some considerations when you're looking at running perfSONAR and Docker. So I think one of the first ones that always comes to people's mind when you're thinking about perfSONAR in a lot of different contexts is the performance, since that's ultimately what it's trying to do is measure some network performance for you. So one nice thing about the containers is that they are relatively lightweight. I think in most of our internal testing, like we found they've had negligible effects on the results compared to bare metal. If there's a spectrum, obviously bare metal is probably always best, right? Containers probably next on the spectrum in terms of being, pretty good. It doesn't really add very many layers in between. And then kind of VMs are kind of the heavier weight option in terms of running these, which you can still do it. You just have to be conscious that there's kind of hypervisors and other things in between, and that could potentially skew your results, and you might have to end up debugging when you're looking at things. So it's got some nice features as far as that goes. Where things can get a little bit fuzzy is networking. So the Docker networking stack can be interesting to say the least, and things can get a little bit complicated depending on what you're trying to do. So one of the, probably the easiest way to run it, and like what I'll be showing you in this example, is to use what's called host networking, where essentially it just inherits the networking from the host. And there's a bunch of caveats with this, like on Macs and things like that, and that it doesn't entirely really do that even, but especially on Linux hosts, it essentially just inherits the stack, right? And so you can do, pretty much, most of the stuff you'd expect doing kind of bare metal tests. Like IPv6 support's pretty good when you're doing host networking, but if you try to use a different type of networking, really IPv6 is pretty much impossible. You have to do all these tricks with IP tables and things like that, right? And so the reason you might want to do host networking is it does actually kind of break some of the isolation principles. I was highlighting as features, like for example, if we bring up an Apache server that listens on port 443 or whatever. If you have something else listening on 443 on the host, they're going to conflict. So you need to kind of work around that. If you're doing host networking versus it's got some overlay networking with port forwarding features and things like that you can do that are pretty easy to use. But then you kind of lose the IPv6 support. So you've really got to kind of think about what you're doing there when you play around with things. The other thing you'll need to think about is persistent storage. So by default, when you bring up a container, all else being equal, specify any extra options. Whenever you kind of remove that container, all the data associated with it will be gone, which oftentimes is a feature, right? If you're doing ad hoc testing, that may actually be what you want. But if you do want to kind of run this longer term, you just have to make sure you kind of set up and come up with a plan for how you're going to store that data. And I'm going to demo some stuff earlier and talk about kind of how you can do that relatively easily. And then kind of the last thing, obviously, is to think about security, which it should not be the last thing you think about. It's just last on my list. Docker, if you install it on Linux, actually touches IP tables. So if you have Ansible rules or anything like that, those could get blasted. So just be conscious of that. And you also need to be root to start containers on Linux, or you can add users to the Docker group, but depending on what type of access you have or how your systems are set up at your organization, there may be a discussion that needs to be had there with your sysadmins to make either of those things happen. All right, so let me do some kind of examples. So what I'm going to show you guys today is I'm actually on a MacBook Pro right now. So I'm going to show you, how I can bring up the Docker container a couple different ways. One of them actually is somewhat new in 4.3. It's just a shell script that we provide that makes things a little bit easier for people. And I've actually shared on the user list before when some people have ran into issues, in particular on Macs, because it can do some weird stuff with the local host settings and things like that. So it gets around those. So I'm going to kind of just show you some very basic stuff on how to bring it up in a Mac. And then I have a server that I'm going to station to. And I'm going to show you kind of how to set it up with a persistent volume that maintains your psconfig configuration, so you don't have to reset that up every time you destroy and bring up the container. And it's going to use something called Docker Compose to kind of make all that happen. And everything I show you today is going to be, at least once we release 4.3, all the documentation will be updated. And at this link, you'll be able to, basically do everything I do today will be documented there. So I'm going to go out of full screen now. Yeah, I got to show my demo graphic there. And I'm going to go to my terminal. And obviously you can see I didn't clear out my terminal from when I was testing this beforehand. So let's start off. Basically doing this on my Mac. First thing I'm going to do is make sure I didn't leave. I did leave the container up, so I'm going to stop what I was doing before. All right. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger for you guys too. All right. So right now I'm just bringing down a container I had up when I was testing earlier. Okay, cool. All right, so let's talk about how we kind of bring up containers. So as I said, we actually have those images I mentioned. We actually publish those to Docker Hub. So if you have Docker installed, by default, it's able to look at Docker Hub. So you can basically pull that down automatically. So basically, there's this Docker command that you run. It's called Docker run, ironically, that essentially, sorry, the Zoom window is blocking me there. Essentially runs the container. So it's called perfSONAR test point in Docker Hub. So I've listed that there. I've already run this, so it's already downloaded for me. If you haven't downloaded it before, it'll spend a couple minutes downloading it. The options I'm giving it are just to use host networking, like I mentioned, and this -G just tells it to run in the background. So I'm going to do that. Okay, and so our Docker container is already running. It's fired up. You can see what containers you have running. You'll see I have one Grafana one running, but I also have my test point that I just brought up. Then if I want to log into it, there's this Docker exec command that I can run. So if I do that, I have to give it the ID from this container ID so it knows which one to log into, which is a little, some extra steps. So as I said, I'll show you a couple other ways to do this sort of thing. So I'll do that, and then I'm just going to run the bash command. So I basically get a shell, and can start doing normal perfSONAR or anything. So I can now run pscheduler commands. For this example, I'm just going to do a quick pscheduler troubleshoot just to show you. So yep, okay, I've got pscheduler running. It's running the API. It's checking some services. It's going to run a quick idle test just to make sure everything schedules. So hopefully that works there. Takes a couple seconds here, so just making sure all that works. And okay, pscheduler appears to be running normally. Okay, so I'm going to exit out of there. I'm going to do some more of this. So okay, so since that's running, I want to stop that now. And I'm going to show you kind of a slightly alternative way to bring it up. So let me see here, since I don't remember. So I need the container ID again. I'm just going to do Docker stop. That. Okay, so that should bring it down. So basically what I'm going to show next is, as I mentioned, we've added this PS Docker shell script that you can get if you go to that documentation page. Once we update 4.3, it'll have a link to it where you can basically run this command PS Docker. It takes a few options. If you don't give it any options, it just downloads the latest perfSONAR test point image. We actually tag each of the images. So if you ever do want to run a specific version of perfSONAR, you can do something like, version v.2.3 or something like that. And it'll pull down that specific version of perfSONAR. So that's actually one other handy feature of this is it's very easy to get a specific version of perfSONAR. If I want to get like the 4.3 version, actually, I think I have to put start first. I can, or like the beta version, you put it in staging because that's where we put all our beta stuff. You can do that as well. So I'm just going to run the latest perfSONAR 4.2.4. It's going to handle, the test check that the image was up to date. It's going to handle basically bringing things up, and it actually automatically logged me in, so I didn't have to do all that Docker PS stuff. And if I run it and the image is already started, it will actually just log me in automatically. So just kind of a handy utility if you're running things with straight Docker. And so now let's say I want to run a test. I tried to pick a very short test. Can't actually see if this is logging. So I'm going to run a DNS test. That way we don't have to wait forever for it to schedule. So hopefully this works. So yeah, one of the many tools that perfSONAR has is it can run a DNS query and just will give you some information about the timing of that. So I'm going to run one of those. So it's doing its normal pscheduler thing, getting the first run. And there we go. So looked up a record for perfSONAR.net a few times. Seemed to work. So okay, so that's the local container. So a couple weird, so one of the challenges, like I didn't do a throughput test or anything like that. One of the challenges too is, kind of relates to Mark's cloud thing. I'm actually behind a NAT here, and I'm also coming from Comcast. So there's not a lot of great, I was struggling to find a perfSONAR node that I knew about that I had some access to that allowed commercial stuff in, and I didn't add my /32 or anything to the limit. So I was getting blocked that way. So I'm kind of just do some simple examples, but you can do throughput tests. You can do latency tests. On the Mac in particular, if you're doing stuff with ICMP, like ping and things like that, it doesn't always seem to work. And if you Google it, that's some oddness with the Mac deployment of Docker that you'll run into sometimes. So there are quirks of the OSs that you have to be careful of. So that is my local machine. If I go to now a Linux server I have running, I've SSH'd into, I'm going to show a slightly different setup. And so instead of ad hoc testing, I've decided I want to run a container and just kind of have it always running and running my regular tests, right? So instead of doing an RPM install, I'm basically just running the container. So as I mentioned, one of the things you have to worry about is, okay, persistent storage and all that. Like I don't want to have to, every time I bring it up, do the psconfig remote add and add all my psconfig information. There's a tool called Docker Compose, which essentially allows you to define a YAML file. I'm going to change it to the right directory here. That basically describes how you want to run Docker images, and if it's kind of can do some you can run multiple of them and it can bring them up. But for our purposes, I really just want to bring up one test point. So I've got this docker compose.yaml file. Again, this file I'm going to show you. There's going to be a link to it in the docs on the docs.perfSONAR.net page, so you can download it and modify it to your heart's content. But basically, what it says is I've got one service called test point. I'm going to use, so I've actually got this set up to use the beta version of perfSONAR. So I think the one that will be uploaded actually uses the latest. Actually, I know it is. I'm going to tell it to use host networking again. I'm going to have it restart the container on failure. This is actually another option you could give to the Docker container. And then I have one shared volume, which is going to basically share the psconfig directory on my actual host. It's going to mount it to etc perfSONAR psconfig inside the container. And so you'll see I have basically a setup here that looks a lot like if you've ever looked at etc perfSONAR psconfig on your system, it looks a lot like this, right? So it kind of just permanently lives there. So the docker compose command kind of does a lot of the shortcuts and stuff I was doing with that ps docker command. So if you run it, if I want to list everything running, I think I've got a sudo. I mentioned that too in my earlier slides. I've got a sudo before I can do the Docker stuff on Linux. So if I do docker compose ps, I left one running. So I'm going to take that down by doing a docker compose down, and I'm going to do a -v just to kind of like delete all the volumes and everything. So we're really starting fresh. So it's stopping that. And if I do a docker compose up-d, so that'll bring basically my container up. It'll be running in the background. And I know I did bash last time, but if I don't want to do bash, and I've got these copy pasted so you don't have to watch me fumble and type the whole time, I can do basically a docker compose exec command. And so I'm telling it the name of the service basically that was in my docker compose YAML, which was test point. So I could write bash here if I wanted to log into it just like I did before, but I'm just going to run the command straight away. So I'm going to run that. So this is just a basic latency test to another host. Should only take a few seconds here. I reduced the packet count, so it should only be like 30 seconds or so. So it's running, again, doing its normal pscheduler thing. And that. And if I did a psconfig remote like list or anything like that, you'd actually see it has some regular tests configured as well that maintain as I run more of these. So let's see, just give it a second here. We're at 2309, so it's going to be close. So yeah, so that's the container so far. There we go. Okay, so there's our result. Kind of what you'd expect if you're familiar with pscheduler commands. And like I said, if I do a psconfig remote list, you can see too, I have some regular tests that are kind of, that have already been configured. And so I could do a psconfig remote add or something to a different mesh. If I deleted the container and brought it back up, it'd still be there. So that's just another way to kind of run the container. So that was really all I had in terms of just demos. As I said, this was kind of just meant to be a kind of quick introduction as a way to run this in Docker. As I said, it's one of my favorite ways to kind of do ad hoc testing, and there are options to do it as a more dedicated tester if this is kind of your preferred deployment method. And yeah, again, kind of my idea is to hopefully give you guys enough to start playing around with it if you haven't already. And then I think there's probably some really interesting discussions to be had down the line about, how you do this in a little bit more advanced settings and orchestrating these a little bit differently and things like that. So that's really all I had. Any questions?